All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving headfirst into the world of Tom Kettle.
Tom Kettle!
You got it, an Irish nationalist.
Oh, fascinating!
Who just happened to be smack dab in the middle of World War I.
Mm.
And let me tell you, this guy, from what I've read of his work, he was a bit of a walking contradiction, you know.
Yes.
Scholar, politician, soldier.
Well, you've definitely piqued my interest.
Oh, just wait. His story's a wild ride, let me tell you.
And you know what really makes his story pop? It's that historical context.
Right.
We're not just looking at one man's life here.
No.
We're using his words, his experiences as like a window, right?
Yeah.
A window into Europe, teetering on the edge of war.
Yeah.
And how all that chaos, how that war slammed right into Ireland.
Okay, so just try to picture this, all right? 1914.
Okay.
Kettle is totally, completely up to his eyeballs in the fight for Irish home rule.
Of course.
But, and here's the kicker, as this massive war is exploding across Europe, he's in Belgium.
What's he doing in Belgium?
Buying rifles for the Irish volunteers.
Talk about bad timing.
Oh, I know, right? It's almost comical.
It really shows how, like so many others back then, Kettle was laser focused on Ireland's internal struggle.
Tunnel vision.
Totally. Almost completely missing the bigger picture, you know? Like the whole world was about to go kaboom.
In Europe in 1914, I mean, come on.
It was like a powder keg just waiting for a single spark.
And that spark, well, we all know what lit the fuse, right?
Sadly, yes.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
June 28th, 1914, to be exact.
Wow, you really know your history.
We gotta keep those dates straight.
It's impressive.
So picture this. Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is suddenly assassinated.
Just like that.
Boom. Austria-Hungary, they don't waste any time. They slap Serbia with an ultimatum.
An ultimatum.
Yeah, and from there, it's like a domino effect.
Crash, crash, crash.
Exactly. One thing leads to another, and bam, the whole continent's at war.
Kettle himself wrote about this, and it's chilling.
Oh, what did he say?
He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "We were playing with unrealities while this crime of all history was being prepared."
Wow, that sends shivers down my spine.
Right. You can practically feel the world tilting on its axis.
It really captures that feeling of everything changing in the blink of an eye.
Overnight, the world was different.
It really was, and you can see Kettle's own understanding of the situation changing as things unfold.
Yeah.
He was deeply troubled by Germany's actions, even calling them the outlaw of Europe.
Strong words.
He didn't mince words, that's for sure.
And a big chunk of that outrage, that anger, stemmed from what happened to Belgium.
Ah, yes, Belgium.
They were neutral.
Neutral, minding their own business.
Exactly. Their neutrality guaranteed by all these treaties.
All nice and official on paper.
But then Germany, wanting to outflank the French defenses, they issued an ultimatum to Belgium.
An ultimatum? What did they want?
They basically said, "Let us march our troops through your country." Right.
Oh, wow, that's bold.
And Belgium, bless their hearts, they refused.
Stood up to Germany.
They said, "No way. You're not trampling all over our neutrality."
I can only imagine how tense that moment must have been.
And Kettle, remember, he was actually in Belgium when all this went down.
Oh, he had a front row seat to the whole thing.
He saw everything first.
I bet his writing about that period is intense.
It is, his account of the destruction of Termond is just
Heartbreaking.
heartbreaking.
Termond?
Yeah, this town in Belgium.
Oh, I see.
He describes homes being burned, people's lives just completely upended.
It's hard to fathom that level of destruction.
But there's this one detail that really got to me. The beguinage.
No, remind me, what was the beguinage?
It was this peaceful community of nuns.
None.
They lived in these simple little cottages.
Oh,
And Kettle writes about how the Germans, they left the cottages standing,
they did.
but they deliberately destroyed the nuns' church.
That's almost symbolic, isn't it?
It's like they were saying, we have the power to choose what lives and what dies.
Chilling, really chilling.
But, you know, amidst all that destruction, Kettle also points out these moments of, well, humanity.
No, that's good to hear.
He mentions a German officer weeping at the destruction he saw.
Weeping.
Yeah, like even he was overwhelmed by the horror of it all.
It's a reminder that even within an invading army, there are individuals wrestling with their own consciences.
Right. They're not all monsters. They're people caught up in a terrible situation.
It adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
And here's where things get really interesting for me, all right?
Lay it on me.
So we've got Kettle. He's Irish, fighting for Irish home rule.
Right.
But then, boom, World War I erupts.
Yeah.
And he chooses to fight for the Allies.
Hold on, he chooses to fight for the Allies.
He does.
But why? Why would an Irishman fighting for home rule join a war on the continent?
It's a question a lot of people in Ireland were asking themselves at the time, believe me.
I bet.
Kettle believed that Ireland had a duty to something bigger,
Something bigger than home rule.
He felt that Ireland's fight was part of a larger battle for honor and justice, playing out across Europe.
So he saw it as a global fight for freedom.
I think that's a fair way to put it.
I can see how that would resonate with someone like him.
He wrote, then this gets me every time, "It is a grim and awful job, and no man can feel up to it. The science of waste and bloodshed, how my heart loathes it, and yet it is God's only way to justice."
Wow, you can really hear that inner struggle in his words.
Right. The loathing of war, but also this conviction.
A conviction that this was the right thing to do.
Exactly.
It's heartbreaking, though, because his vision of, a united Ireland forged through shared sacrifice, it didn't quite pan out.
Not the way he hoped.
The war left these deep, deep scars, not just on battlefields, but in the hearts of the Irish people.
Yeah,
Many questioned if this was truly their fight.
they did.
Feeling bitter, resentful even, about the lives lost, both in Ireland and on those distant battlefields in France.
It's a tragic side of the story, for sure.
A reminder that war's consequences can be far-reaching and unpredictable.
Absolutely. But you have to understand, Kettle had his reasons for joining the fight.
Well, I'm all ears.
He saw a real darkness, something sinister, in the philosophies driving German aggression.
Like what?
He specifically called out figures like Bismarck and Nietzsche.
Bismarck and Nietzsche, what did they do?
He was especially disturbed by Bismarck's whole blood and iron philosophy.
Blood and iron, what does that even mean?
The idea that power, that political change, comes from brute force, from violence.
So might makes right.
Exactly.
I see where Kettle's coming from.
Kettle even cited Bismarck's callous remarks about the burning of French villages during the Franco-Prussian War.
Oh, man.
He found them absolutely repugnant.
I can't say I blame him.
And then you've got Nietzsche with his ideas about the Superman and this glorification of raw power.
So like survival of the fittest.
In a way, yes.
I can see how that would have resonated with the brutality of the war.
It's almost like those ideas were playing out on the battlefields of Europe.
A clash of ideologies made flesh and blood.
Exactly, and that's what worried Kettle, this darkness that seemed to be consuming the world.
And it's like watching those ideas play out in the real world,
It's disturbing, to say the least.
It is. It really is.
Systematic destruction, the targeting of civilians, it's a whole different kind of warfare.
And that brings us to Kettle's biggest warning.
Oh, what's that?
This fear he had that the war was being corrupted, that the noble fight for justice and freedom, it was turning into something ugly.
Like what? What was he afraid of?
He called it a war for trade.
A war for trade. What does that even mean?
He saw these profiteers,
Profiteers.
getting rich, lining their pockets, while young men were dying in the trenches.
That's awful.
He was furious about it, like genuinely angry.
I bet.
He felt like greed, like pure self-interest. It was hijacking the whole point of the war.
So what did he propose? What was the alternative?
He was a huge advocate for, a new kind of diplomacy.
A new kind of diplomacy.
One built on, liberation, cooperation between nations.
So it's pretty idealistic.
It was. But he truly believed in it.
He even wrote, "An attempt is being made to transform what began as a war for honor into a war for trade. The inscription 'justice' is to be hauled down, and 'markets' is to be hoisted in its stead."
Powerful words.
They really are.
And it's a warning, wouldn't you say?
A warning.
That still rings true today, in a way.
How so?
Well, think about it. We see these conflicts popping up all over the place, driven by, economic interests,
Right.
often disguised as some fight for, freedom and democracy.
It's disheartening, to say the least.
It is. It really is.
But I was also struck by Kettle's writings about Belgium before the war, in peacetime.
Oh, what did he say?
He paints this picture of this small but super industrious nation.
Industrious.
They had these bustling factory, thriving agricultural cooperative.
Sounds like they were doing pretty well for themselves.
They were. It's like they were a model for progress, for social innovation.
So all that just wiped out.
Yeah, it makes the destruction all the more tragic, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
Kettle emphasizes that, the work of generations, gone in a few short weeks.
Goof. Just like that.
And he draws some interesting parallels between Belgium and Ireland.
Parallels.
Yeah, both heavily reliant on agriculture, both fighting for autonomy.
That's an interesting connection.
It is, and you can really sense his respect for the Belgians, their resilience, their spirit.
You can.
Oh, yeah, especially in how he describes their response to the invasion. They fought back with everything they had, even though they were totally outmatched.
The underdog story, always a classic.
He even describes the Belgian soldiers as little black rats, popping up from their trenches, harassing the enemy, then disappearing back into the earth.
That's a pretty vivid image.
He had a way with words, that's for sure.
But did he only focus on, like, the big battles?
No, he gives us these amazing glimpses into the daily lives of the soldiers, what it was really like in the trenches.
Oh, the trenches. I can only imagine how brutal that must have been.
It was, and Kettle doesn't sugarcoat it. He describes the mud, the rats, the constant fear of snipers.
Yikes.
The sheer boredom, the waiting, punctuated by these moments of terrifying violence.
Sounds absolutely exhausting.
But even then, amidst all that, he finds these moments of humor, of beauty even.
Really?
There's this passage where he's talking about the system of transportation that kept the army supplied, and he compares it to a giant Carter Patterson.
Carter Patterson?
Yeah, it was like this big delivery service in England back then.
Oh, okay.
Keeping the whole war machine running.
He found humor in the logistics of war.
It's those little details, you know? They make his writing so compelling, so human.
It's the little things, right?
Exactly.
But then he'll hit you with this gut-wrenching description of a battlefield or the aftermath of an artillery bombardment. Yeah, it's that contrast, that back and forth, that makes it so powerful.
You're right. It's a real roller coaster.
It must be. But in all that chaos, all that horror, did he ever talk about camaraderie?
He did, actually, quite a bit. He talks about this sense of brotherhood that developed among the soldiers.
I can imagine that, going through something like that together.
They were facing death side by side, sharing these incredibly intense experiences.
It creates a bond, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's a bond that went beyond their differences, you know, class, religion, even nationality.
That's powerful. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, human connection can still shine through.
And it makes his ultimate sacrifice all the more poignant.
It does. But speaking of sacrifice, his decision to fight for the Allies, despite being Irish and so deeply involved in the fight for home rule.
It's a head scratcher, isn't it?
It is. Why would he choose that?
He was caught between these two loyalties, you know, his loyalty to Ireland and this belief in a larger fight for justice and freedom.
A tough spot to be in.
It was a dilemma a lot of Irish people faced at the time.
I bet.
Kettle believed that Ireland had a duty, an obligation to something bigger, to a greater cause.
So he saw it as a global fight.
I think that's a good way to put it. He felt that Ireland's destiny was tied to this broader struggle for honor and justice playing out across Europe.
It was an idealistic view, wasn't it?
It was, very much so.
But it clearly resonated with him deeply.
He wrote, and I think this really captures his mindset, "It is a grim and awful job, and no man can feel up to it. The science of waste and bloodshed. How my heart loathes it, and yet it is God's only way to justice."
It's like he was resigned to it, wasn't he? Like he hated war, but saw it as a necessary evil.
There's that conflict again, that tension.
But it's tragic, you know, because his vision of a united Ireland forged in shared sacrifice.
It didn't really happen.
Not the way he envisioned it. The war left its mark, these deep wounds, not just on the battlefields, but on the soul of Ireland.
People questioned if this was truly their fight.
They did.
There was resentment, bitterness over the lives lost, both in Ireland and over there in France.
Another reminder of war's unpredictable consequences, right?
It is. Sometimes even the best intentions can lead to unforeseen outcomes.
And that's what Kettle forces us to confront in his writing, isn't it?
He does.
The complexity of it all, the moral ambiguity. He doesn't give us easy answers. He just lays it all out there.
And makes us think, makes us question.
Exactly. Where do we draw the line between patriotism and nationalism? How do we justify fighting for a cause, even a just one, when war is inherently brutal?
Those are questions that still resonate today, don't they?
They do. They really do, especially in a world that's still filled with conflict and ideological divides.
You're right. Now, aside from his writings about the war itself, Kettle also had some fascinating insights into the culture and philosophy of Europe at the time, particularly France. He talks about this idea, a new France, emerging in the early 20th century.
A new France. What did he mean by that?
He saw France grappling with its identity, its place in the world.
Okay, I'm listening.
He was drawn to the intellectual and artistic energy of that period.
I can see that France has always been a hub for creativity.
Exactly. And he saw this shift happening, a move away from the decadence and cynicism of the late 19th century towards something more serious, more spiritual.
So a kind of cultural rebirth.
I think that's a good way to put it. He even mentions figures like Paul Bourget, the novelist, and Emile Durkheim, the sociologist.
Those are some big names.
They were both exploring these themes of social cohesion, moral responsibility.
Sounds pretty heady.
It is, but Kettle was fascinated by it all.
Was there anything else that caught his attention?
He was particularly intrigued by the role of the Catholic Church in this new France.
Interesting. How so?
He writes about these soldier priests, serving in the army, their faith being tested and strengthened in the trenches.
That's a powerful image.
It is, and of course, Kettle himself was a devout Catholic.
That's right. I'd almost forgotten.
He saw his faith as this source of strength, a moral compass in a world that seemed to have lost its way.
A guiding light in the darkness.
Exactly. He believed that faith could give meaning, give purpose in the face of suffering, that it could be a driving force in rebuilding a shattered world.
A powerful conviction.
It was. And it's interesting to contrast this with his analysis of German thinkers like Bismarck and Nietzsche.
Ah, yes, the bad guys.
He saw them as espousing these philosophies that, in a way, contributed to the horrors of the war.
I see where he's coming from.
He was very critical of Bismarck's whole blood and iron philosophy, this belief that power ultimately comes from force.
Might mix. Right, we talked about that.
And he saw a disturbing parallel between that and Nietzsche's concept of the Superman.
The Superman.
With its glorification of power, its rejection of pity.
So a kind of a ruthless, individualistic worldview.
You could say that.
And Kettle saw that as dangerous, as contributing to the atrocities of the war.
He did. He was deeply troubled by the influence of these thinkers on German society.
He even went so far as to say that the Germans had been misled by these drill sergeants of metaphysics.
Drill sergeants of metaphysics, what a phrase.
It's a good one, right?
It is, and it highlights his belief that these philosophers, they'd convinced the Germans of their own superiority, their destiny to rule the world.
So, like, a kind of intellectual arrogance.
I think that's a fair assessment. And Kettle saw that as a dangerous delusion, one that blinded them to the moral consequences of their actions.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The power of ideas to shape or even distort our perception of the world.
It is. It really makes you think. It's amazing how Kettle can be so critical of German aggression, but still show those flashes of, recognizing their humanity.
Yeah, he never lets us forget that there are people on both sides caught up in this whole war machine.
It really makes you think, where do you draw the line between, patriotism and just blind nationalism?
That's a good question.
And how do you reconcile fighting for a cause, even a good one, when war is so brutal?
It's something Kettle really struggled with.
He did.
And it's still relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, you can really see him wrestling with this stuff in his writing.
He's not afraid to challenge his own side.
Not at all.
Call out hypocrisy and corruption wherever he sees it.
Yeah.
It's like he's reminding us that fighting for a just cause, it doesn't mean you become the very thing you're fighting against.
It's a powerful lesson, even a century later.
It is.
He died believing that a new world order could come out of all this, a world based on cooperation and respect.
It's a hopeful vision.
It is, but looking back, did he die for a dream? Or did his sacrifice actually help create a better future? I mean, what do you think?
That's the question, isn't it? Did the world really learn from World War I, or are we just going to keep making the same mistakes?
The tough one.
It is, but Kettle's story, it makes us confront those hard truths, examine our own beliefs and actions, and think about the world we want to build.
He believed in the power of ideas to change the world.
He did.
And his writing is a powerful reminder that words have consequences,
For sure.
The stories we tell, the things we believe, they can shape the course of history. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this. What ideas will you choose to embrace? What kind of world will you help create?